What I'd like to do as we get started today is briefly recap what we looked at last time and then head into today's discussion. In our first session of this series, we looked at who a Catholic might vote for, not specific candidates, but principles for when it would be appropriate to vote for a certain candidate over another one. And some of the main points we discussed last time came from the document of the United States bishops called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. And that will continue to be our guide today. We looked at the fact that it would be wrong for a Catholic to vote for somebody who has an evil policy that they like and want that to happen. If they intend to support by their vote an evil policy, that would be wrong. The other thing we looked at is that if there are multiple candidates who propose to do things that are intrinsically evil, things that are going to be wrong no matter the circumstances because of the moral issues involved, then a Catholic can either decide to vote for neither of the two candidates or maybe consider a third-party candidate or do something else when it comes to voting. But it would be, in the document's words, legitimate for a voter to disqualify a candidate based on a particular intrinsically evil act that they might support. Ideally, our candidates wouldn't be promoting anything evil, and it would be a very easy thing to do, to vote. Sometimes, though, there are some controversial matters that our candidates are involved with that we have to discern how to handle. And this kind of relates to the teaching of Catholic morality called the principle of double effect, which means that, like voting, for example, if you vote for somebody who does something evil, that's not on you, unless you voted for them without really realizing what you're doing. But if you are voting for somebody that is sort of a morally neutral or maybe even a good act, and it might have some bad consequences, but based on the consequences that are good of voting for a person, that might outweigh the evil effects. But the action of voting itself is not intrinsically wrong if you're not supporting a candidate for bad reasons. So that's sort of what we looked at last time. And today we're looking at what issues matter most according to Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching emerged in its modern form in the late 1800s, especially with Pope Leo XIII responding to some of the issues going on in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and all of the societal changes that emerged because of that, as well as the issue of Marxism that was also at the time on the Church's radar as something to address. And since then, the Church has produced a number of writings, especially papal encyclicals and bishops' documents that guide Catholics as to how we can live in society together. In Catholic social teaching, there tend to be at least 7 major themes that are looked at. One of them is the fact that God has created this world, and so how we view our relationship with each other should be understood in that context, that God designed us for certain good things and wants us to be pursuing what is good rather than evil. A fundamental part of Catholic social teaching is the dignity of human life, that God has given all of us His image, and we, through His grace, are trying to live in the likeness of God who is our Father. So we want to treat one another in society in love as fellow children of God, and to see the dignity of every human life, no matter who they are or what they've done. We also acknowledge not just the dignity of human beings, but also the relationships that people have with each other. So this would include our obligations toward each other in family, our friendships, our communities, our civic participation, and our worldwide solidarity with other people. All of this relates to our need for relationship and our need to affirm what is good in the other. So we have in Catholic social teaching focus on the human being, on human relationships, and also on human action. When we realize God is our creator and our identity as His children, and the relationships we have with other people, which involve certain rights and responsibilities we exercise with each other, then we know that there are principles that guide our action. such as caring for the poor and vulnerable in our society, respecting the dignity of work, working hard, promoting a good economy through our action, and maintaining people's rights as they do well by others. So these themes of Catholic social teaching are relevant to many of the issues that come to be voted upon every election cycle. So for the rest of our time together, we're going to be reflecting further on this document which has been updated by the Church every 4 years, the year prior to a presidential election in the United States, called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, a call to political responsibility. So, what I'd like to do beginning things out here is to quote from first the preface of this document, which was very recently updated. And then some further quotes from the document have been the same for at least some years. This preface addresses what are the issues going on right now. We recognize that in our society there are many issues to be concerned about. And in our Catholic social teaching, which develops the teachings of Jesus in a moral sense, there are certain issues that are most fundamental that we have to keep in mind. Certainly the idea that God is our creator and we are all given dignity as God's children. That is one of the most fundamental things we can focus on. So I'd like to quote from this paragraph from the preface of the document. And this speaks to the importance of the dignity of the human person and human life when it comes to Catholic teaching on social issues. Quote, "The threat of abortion remains our preeminent priority because it directly attacks our most vulnerable and voiceless brothers and sisters and destroys more than 1 million lives per year in our country alone. Other grave threats to the life and dignity of the human person include euthanasia, gun violence, terrorism, the death penalty, and human trafficking. There is also the redefinition of marriage and gender, threats to religious freedom at home and abroad, lack of justice for the poor, the suffering of migrants and refugees, wars and famines around the world, racism, the need for greater access to health care and education, care for our common home, the earth, and more. All threaten the dignity of the human person." In our last session, we talked about how Catholics are not single-issue voters. There are certain issues that are preeminent among all of them because they involve a disrespect for human life. But we recognize that there are so many things in our society which can undercut human dignity and even life itself. There are some actions that are considered morally egregious because they inflict death upon those who are innocent. But we also need to be aware of how we treat one another throughout life. And this holistic approach to Catholic morality is something very important to keep in mind as we think about the first principles that we want to advocate through our votes for candidates. So that's a quotation from the preface of the document. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions they wanted to get into about that? Okay, so we'll think about this a little bit more and press on. I have a couple more quotes here from the document. The right to life implies and is linked to other human rights, to the basic goods that every human person needs to live and thrive. All the life issues are connected, for erosion of respect for the life of any individual or group in society necessarily diminishes respect for all life. The moral imperative to respond to the needs of our neighbors, basic needs such as food, shelter, healthcare, education, and meaningful work, is universally binding on our consciences and may be legitimately fulfilled by a variety of means. Catholics must seek the best ways to respond to these needs. We have a reference here to our conscience, our ability to make right judgments about how to live well with others in society. And our consciences are formed in many ways by our awareness of the rights of people, our awareness of God as our Father. And the way that we treat one another has to tap into our commitment to see to it that other people are able to find well-being in their life. Furthermore, Catholic voters should use the framework of Catholic social teaching to examine candidates' positions on issues affecting human life and dignity, as well as issues of justice and peace. And they should consider candidates' integrity, philosophy, and performance. It is also important for all citizens to see beyond party politics, to analyze campaign rhetoric critically, and to choose their political leaders according to principle, not party affiliation or mere self-interest. And that's a reference to living the gospel of life. So, the bishops of the United States, with this framework in mind of Catholic social teaching, in the rest of this document, they advocate various things that should be resisted and things that should be promoted in our society. Before outlining these things, they note, as a way of introduction, the following. We bishops call attention to issues with significant moral dimensions that should be carefully considered in each campaign and as policy decisions are made in the years to come. Some issues involve principles that can never be abandoned. Others reflect our judgment about the best way to apply Catholic principles to policy issues. So before we even get into these various things, it's important to note a distinction between moral principles that are taught infallibly by our church, that come very clearly from the revelation of Jesus Christ, that involve no gray area. But there are also matters that involve a lot of difficult discernment. And so one way of trying to fit all the pieces of our society into a united whole that promotes the common good for all, that can be quite challenging. Sometimes you might focus on one area of our society and benefit that, but then neglect others. And then it's hard to see how you can do everything right by everyone and make sure that all significant issues are addressed responsibly. So this involves a lot of prudential judgment, using your conscience to make a good decision about how to deal with all of these issues. Because sometimes, if you think about whack-a-mole, you deal with one thing and then another issue pops up, and you didn't necessarily see that coming. So some of the judgments here presented by the bishops are their awareness of how they might try to deal with the whole scope of issues, but exactly how to address all of these issues and exactly how to make sure serving the common good in one area does not ignore other areas is something that we need to discern as well. So what I want to say here is that the bishops of the United States are not speaking infallibly on all of the issues they're talking about when it comes to politics, and they're not saying that this is exactly how you have to handle these issues or else you're not following Jesus. It's more of how the wisdom of our church is bringing its Catholic social teaching, which develops from Jesus, bearing upon all the issues we face in our world today. So that is sort of the framework that I'd like to propose we examine these things with. Before we look at all of these issues, does anyone have any thoughts or questions so far? Yes?
I had a question because I know, and you've said it, and we've heard it often, that the church can't tell you how to vote. But this week I was kind of scanning different things on websites, and I came across Cardinal Gregory's, Wilton Gregory's latest paper. And he says it too. He says the church does not tell you how to vote, but but wisely recommends only ethical principles and a moral framework for people to consider and to evaluate when you are about to make crucially important decisions regarding your vote in this election. But then they go on to say, and I think it's, just see here, he says, the dignity of human life will always be a foundational issue that we face in our society, in our world. And towards the end, he talks about, my brother Marilyn Bishops and I have issued a joint statement urging voters to stand in true solidarity with women and human life and dignity by voting no on question 1 in Maryland. So while they say the bishops can't tell us how to vote, I mean, on particular propositions, they're clearly urging you to vote. I mean, it's not telling you to vote, but, and then I just saw recently on a news feed, but I didn't print it out, New York bishops have come out against Proposition 1. So I guess I'm kind of confused in the sense that the church can't tell us who to vote for, but they're certainly telling us to vote no on certain issues.
Because they're speaking on issues rather than a candidate.
Rather than a
That could be.
person, yeah.
So one thing to clarify, it's not as though the church can't. I mean, sometimes bishops have suggested which candidate to vote for or what issues or propositions to vote yes or no for. But as a matter of prudence, especially considering what the scope of the church's authority is, it's often wise for the church to promote understanding of ethical principles that are not caught up in the weeds of historical issues that the church might not know all the facts about necessarily, but the moral principles are quite clear because they come from the apostolic tradition from Jesus. So for that reason, you do have some bishops making statements about propositions or about certain candidates that have problematic or desirable qualities. And some priests or bishops might, in some cases, promote voting for a certain person. But generally, as a rule, the church advises against politicking in the church. But being aware of political wisdom and truth.
They're tax exempt.
Yeah.
If they give the appearance of promoting.
Yeah, and then there's a conflict of interest in that case.
Right.
They're held with
Yes.
tax exemption.
Well, we're
Right.
losing it anyway in New York, whether you know it or not, but.
Yeah, that's an interesting point with regard to issues. I mean, just the thing that popped in my head, I mean, if there was an amendment or something that said, okay, it's a vote for either, abortion on demand for whomever, whenever, or not, I think the church would probably recommend to Catholics to vote against that. But that's a particular issue, not necessarily a particular candidate. So I think that's a reasonable line to draw, maybe. Because I've never heard anyone in the church recommend, at least officially, to vote for a particular candidate.
Right, I hadn't either, but then when I saw that,
Yeah.
it just made me think.
Yeah,
oh,
that's interesting.
And then I started looking, well, what does New York say about abortion? Because I never really thought about what, and we allow up to 24 weeks on abortion. You start reading one thing and you say, oh, well, I wonder what this does mean, and it's like you said, it's important to be informed and.
Yes, that's the key. That's the key thing. Yeah.
And I can see too, I have a thought, I hope I articulate what my thought is on it, that it could create a real personal moral conflict or a personal conflict due to free will and your own conscience. If your conscience is strongly telling you to support or decline, one thing or the other, and then the church would come out and promote something that is opposite of that.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do? Do you vote because my church says this is a great idea, but personally my own moral and my own conscience says this is what you should be doing? How do you balance that?
Yes. I would pitch that our next Faith Formation series after this one is actually going to get into what do you do if you disagree with the church on some issues, and how do you navigate that?
Right, and it's not just obviously within the context of voting.
Yeah, right.
What you just described there certainly can be put in many other contexts,
Yes.
which we deal with not just in election years, and other aspects of life. So absolutely, that's a great question, and one that deserves a whole series.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm ahead of my time.
There you go.
All right. So let's dive into 11 major areas that the bishops of the United States have centered attention on for our discernment as voters. So the document, the whole second part of this document gets into a lot of detailed issues, proposals, things that are morally good or morally bad, things that involve injustices or things that need to be fixed in our society. So these are grouped based on 11 categories. The first one has to do with human life, which is really one of the preeminent issues of Catholic social teaching. The bishops of the United States note that some things to resist in society include abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, cloning, human embryo destruction, genocide, torture, targeting of non-combatants in war, violent crime, and death penalty. And on the contrary, things to promote in society, which in some ways undercut some of the evils that we try to resist, would be adoption as an alternative to abortion, health care for the sick and dying to diminish the perceived need for euthanasia or assisted suicide, assistance to pregnant women also as a means to affirm the dignity of women as well as their unborn children, and then to also hopefully diminish the amount of abortion. But providing assistance also to children and families and those in poverty so that the family can have life and well-being. The second major issue is promoting peace. So some things to resist in this area would be unjust war, terrorism, aggression, preemptive military action, which would mean a country attacks another without any proof or moral certainty that an attack is imminent. So one country might get a little ahead of themselves and escalate a global conflict because they perceive a threat that they don't necessarily have the evidence is actually going to bear fruit or will actually happen. Disproportionate military action, so overcompensating for something that's perceived as an offense, maybe attacking a whole population way out of proportion compared to what evil may have been done by that country to one's own, for example. Another issue would be religious persecution and the use of weapons of mass destruction. And the Church, ever since the invention of nuclear weapons, has been advocating for deproliferation, generally speaking. On the flip side, things to promote would include peace, of course, peace is wonderful, defending the innocent against grave evil, seeking conflict resolution, affirming people's right to a conscientious objection to war, especially if it's an unjust war that doesn't have reasonable reasons for it. Nuclear disarmament, addressing humanitarian and refugee crises, and addressing the root causes of violence throughout society. Another issue is marriage and family. Some things to resist, the bishops say, is ideologies of gender that dismiss sexual difference and the complementarity of the sexes, and falsely present gender as nothing more than a social construct or psychological reality that a person may choose at variance with his or her biological reality. Also to be resisted are unjust discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation, and mandates for Catholic institutions to provide insurance coverage for abortion and contraception. So those are some things that are resisted. The Church does not always use the language of gender identity or sexual orientation, but it does speak to the fact that discrimination against those with a same-sex attraction or those who have non-traditional identity that they affirm for themselves, they shouldn't be discriminated in certain respects based on how they are children of God, and they should be not have their rights violated for any reason. But holistically looking at the issue of gender and sexuality from that perspective. On the contrary, things to promote with respect to marriage and family life would be defining, recognizing, and protecting marriage as an exclusive commitment between a man and a woman and as the source of the next generation and a protective haven for children. Promoting also policies on taxes, work, divorce, immigration, and welfare that uphold the God-given meaning and value of marriage and family, helping families stay together, and rewarding responsibility and sacrifice for children. Promoting also wages that allow workers to support their families. Providing public assistance that help poor families live in dignity, provided in a manner that promotes eventual financial autonomy. And promoting the valuation, protection, and nurturing of children. Another important issue in Catholic social teaching is the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, which is involved with economic justice. The first thing we should consider as to the health of our society is how are the worst, most vulnerable among us faring right now? If they are not doing well, then no matter how well other people are doing, there is a serious problem that needs to be addressed. So some things to resist would be the unjust discrimination in the economy based on race, religion, sex, ethnicity, disabling condition, age, etc. And economic inequalities, also predatory lending, which is involved with the religious issue of usury, which has an interesting history in its acceptance or resistance to it. Also resisting economic and cultural factors that contribute to family breakdown, which is often linked with poverty. Strong families definitely are correlated with less poverty in many respects. Things to promote would be job creation, just wages, decent working conditions, equal pay for equal work, the right to collective bargaining, economic freedom, private property rights, healthy relationships between employees and employers, social security, safe and affordable housing, food security, and sustainable agriculture. Also to promote welfare policies and tax credits that reduce poverty and dependency, that strengthen family life, and that help families leave poverty through work, training, and assistance with childcare, healthcare, housing, and transportation. And also, the Church seeks to promote a safety net for those who cannot work. Another issue is healthcare. Things to resist would be unaffordable and inaccessible healthcare, because we all have a right to access healthcare that we need to survive and thrive. Things to promote would be meeting the needs of the poor and uninsured or underinsured, compassionate care that reflects Catholic moral values for those who are suffering and coping with addictions. Migration is another issue as well to consider. Things to resist concerning migration are the displacement of people due to war, injustice, and economic instability. The Church speaks about the ideal that we enable people to remain in their homeland of origin, because there's a cultural value to that, and people being forced to relocate because of injustices is not a good thing for our world, especially because it can also lead to human trafficking. And the great evils involved with that are to be resisted quite strongly. Some things to promote concerning migration would be comprehensive immigration reform with fair legalization programs, care for immigrants, especially children, refugees, asylum seekers, those unnecessarily detained, and victims of human trafficking. Also, we wish to promote family reunification policies, addressing the root causes of migration, and government control of borders that is just and humane. The Church seeks to balance the right of countries to regulate their borders, but also welcoming the immigrant in a humane way. Some more issues. One is Catholic education, which is not necessarily Catholic schools, but a Catholic philosophy of education. Things to resist would be unsafe and unsatisfactory educational environments for children, and barriers to intellectual, moral, spiritual, and physical education. Things to promote would be the fundamental right of parents to educate their children, or to choose the education best suited to their children's needs. Another issue Promoting justice and countering violence. Things to resist here would be violent crime, gun violence, and legacies of injustice that are associated with what we call social sin in our society. Cycles that just are built into our institutions that are unjust. Things to promote would be the reformation of the criminal justice system so that it is humane and remedial and not merely punitive. Also, promoting strong relationship between police and communities and protection of voting rights. We also should care for our common home, the earth which God made as our home. Some things to resist would be negative impact of climate change, natural disasters, and environmental devastation on the poor and vulnerable in the U.S. and around the world. We also resist a social reality of consumerism, where products are bought and bought and bought, and decent goods are thrown out or just, it's wasteful. It's a culture of waste in Pope Francis's teaching. Some things to promote with respect to our common home, the earth, is protecting the land, water, and air, energy conservation, development of alternate renewable and clean energy resources, addressing global climate change, and sustainable development of poorer nations. Another issue is related to communications, media, and culture. Some things to resist would be the concentration of media control into a few parties who might be interested in a particular agenda such that the people's right to information is not properly served. Also, the distribution of offensive materials. That would be especially offensive to young children or those that would offend people's religious identity and other areas that are very important. Things to promote would be responsible regulation of media to protect children and families, and also providing internet accessibility to people. The final issue addressed in the document is global solidarity. Solidarity involves the union of people around the world based on perceived common goals, common goods. Things to resist that undermine global solidarity are global poverty. If we don't have a concern for the poor, especially in those nations around the world that are more impoverished than our own, then there's a lack of solidarity there internationally. Some things to promote globally would be human rights, international law, asylum for refugees, and addressing regional conflicts. So this has been an overview of the many issues that our bishops of the United States are concerned about, which we should consider as voters as we form our consciences for elections. With that being said, having laid all of these issues out on the table, is there anything that you particularly would like to talk about, you're thinking about, you'd like to discuss about these issues?
Yeah. Most of the topics you talked about are very non-controversial and make total sense to everybody, I think. One topic, the first topic we talked about is very controversial, abortion. Mm-hmm. Just a couple of points about that. Where's the church these days about the use of birth control by people who may not want to have children? Mm-hmm. The right, the right of a woman who used to be a fetus. Half of the fetuses turn out to be women. Grow up. And a women's right to their own body to decide what happens in their body. Right? Young children that are impregnated when they're raped or incest, their right, should they be able to have abortion? Just a couple of topics maybe
Absolutely.
discussed.
Yes, and those are especially divisive and controversial issues that have really led to a lot of split electorally. So the Catholic Church continues to teach that the use of birth control in order to avoid pregnancy specifically within sexual relationships is immoral because it's thwarting the natural intended purpose of sexual intimacy. That sexual acts are supposed to involve the complete intimacy of husbands and wives, but also an openness to life. And anything that is done to prevent that natural act from fulfilling either of those two purposes would be morally lacking. So Catholics are taught by our church that this would be a moral evil. When it comes to the use of birth control and contraceptives in society, it is something viewed by the Catholic tradition as immoral. A secondary question involves the regulation of those technologies that are used by those who don't have a moral problem with them, and that's something we can talk about as well. When it comes to the issue of abortion, the Church also notes that although we do have a right over our own bodies, it is not an absolute right. What I mean by that is that there are certain limits to our self-ownership. John Locke, for example, a political philosopher, would say that we have absolute self-ownership over ourselves. We can do with ourselves whatever we want with our bodies, with our work, anything. But from a Catholic moral context, we recognize that we are not just our own, that we have been created by God, and that creative act of God implies that ourselves, we are meant for good, especially if you consider the creation of life within the wombs of those women who carry this precious God-given gift within themselves. So in that case, does bodily autonomy include a right to what is sometimes labeled reproductive rights? The Church would say no, because the life within oneself, in that case, would be a God-given thing, a God-given life, a person who is developing. And so for that reason, no matter what led to the creation of that life, God certainly had a hand in it too, because God breathed life into this being, this person, giving that person a soul. So no matter what horrific events may have led to the conception of that life, that does not make the life thus conceived to be dispensable. So those are some things the Church would advise us to consider. Thoughts?
Yeah, and in no way does that make that issue easy. Any of those issues easy. But the truth is important to know when you're addressing those kind of situations. Not to make it easy, but to give you an understanding of what the situation really is. That's all. It's not meant to erase the difficulty involved in any of those situations, and the Church recognizes that. And that's why the Church does so much to address the needs of people in desperate situations.
Which is why the Church notes that if you were to only promote the right of the unborn to life, but have no regard for the well-being of women, that would be an injustice. So the Church advocates that as much as we seek to promote the life of the unborn, we should also serve the needs of mothers and families that are especially in a difficult situation because of any evil inflicted upon them by society, by perpetrators, by anybody who has undermined their own right to sexual autonomy, to a healthy family life. So the Church wants us to address this social issue both with a concern for life, but also a concern for the dignity of mothers. Yes.
You know, I wanted to try to find out, what does the medical profession say about abortion? You know, we hear all of the women's, they call it the women's health issue, but, so I got online and it says, one article I have, the American College of Pediatricians concurs with the body of scientific evidence that corroborates that a unique human life starts when the sperm and egg bind to each other in a process of fusion of their respective membranes, and a single hybrid cell called a zygote, or one cell embryo is created. All human lives equally from the moment of conception, fertilization until natural death. That's what they value. So I guess when I started reading that, I thought, taking aside all of the issues, of course, the difficulties that in a situation of rape or whatever, but I guess I have a hard time understanding why are we even having this, why is it such a difficult issue if both the church, the Catholic Church, and I think a lot of Christians, and the medical societies, they all agree that life begins at conception. Why are we not focusing, instead of quote-unquote a woman's health, why aren't we just focusing on helping women, like you said, in these situations? And the other thing, as a woman, I get upset with the fact that it's a woman's issue. A woman doesn't get pregnant by herself. And there's no discussion either in the church or in politics about the men that are involved here and where is their responsibility. And I just really take offense at that a woman didn't get there by herself, so why is it her problem? I understand it's not her body anymore, totally. And the other thing that I was thinking when you were talking too is the church speaks, like you said, within reason we have autonomy over our body, we have what we can do with our body, but the church speaks against suicide, doesn't it? You can't do anything you want. And then I laugh because in New York State, you can't even get in your car. You have to put a seatbelt on. The state tells you what you have to do with your body, even driving your car. You have to protect your body. It just seems like so crazy. Some of the laws that we have are just, they don't make any sense. And when I saw that the scientific community believes that life begins at conception, it's kind of hard for me to understand why this is such a difficult issue.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm making it too simplistic,
No.
but why can't we all just come together and solve this?
Yeah.
That's the problem, is that we've done the opposite of that. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, that should have been a great victory for life. And the rollout of it has been awful because of both sides. Because the pro-abortion side has manipulated difficult cases, and they've claimed that women have been denied care for abortions, and for miscarriages, women who had natural miscarriages by no fault of their own have been denied the health care they needed, and they've died as a result, or they've had to have a hysterectomy as a result, and blah, blah, blah. So they're manipulating this and saying that doctors are afraid that they're going to go to jail if they provide miscarriage care. But then you've got the pro-life side, too, has been somewhat negligent in promoting a good rollout of this, too. So instead of coming together and work together, we're just going the opposite direction. Both sides are kind of manipulating things. I think the pro-abortion side much more so, don't get me wrong, but the pro-life side isn't entirely guilt-free either. And I think a big part of that is that within the pro-life movement, not everyone in the pro-life movement is Catholic. So you have a lot of pro-life people in the pro-life movement who are just fine with IVF and with, methods of birth control that can actually cause an abortion. They're okay with that stuff. So we don't have the unity we need to really make this come about. And that's why I've always said, yes, we need a legal, we should not have a legal mandate for abortion. That should be illegal, absolutely. But the flip side of that is we need a conversion of heart. If you don't have that conversion of hearts, I'm sorry, abortion's not going to stop. It's not going to stop no matter how legal you make it. Because people are going to just be sneaky and manipulative and find a way, whether it's getting the medication or whatever, if you don't have that conversion of heart that goes along with it. And when you have politicians who claim to be pro-life, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but then in the same breath, these people do very immoral things, that just, I noticed from my own family, because my own family is very pro-abortion, that just gives them ammunition. See, that's what a pro-life person looks like. If that's what a pro-life person looks like, I don't want to be part of it. Now, are they just jumping at an excuse? Maybe they are, but I don't want to be the one to give them that excuse. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ideally, law is supposed to guide us toward the common good. But sometimes if on paper a law is good, but it's not addressing other issues, like, you're mentioning different things that are not served, because it's just a unilateral focus on when it's permitted, and not really dealing with who is involved in these cases that lead to abortions. Holding men accountable is one issue. Having programs meant to serve women who are unjustly impregnated against their will. Things like that certainly would involve greater need of our society to flesh out these laws so they really do lead to a social peace and not to rhetorical attacks. Now, certainly during an election season, there's a lot of emphasis on persuading people through rhetoric, saying these are the extreme cases we have to avoid, and the other side will do the same thing. Ideally, when people come into office, hopefully the policies they promote are not governed by rhetoric, and we have to pray that our politics is not consumed by partisan rhetoric and not really serving the whole need of our society, and just focusing on parts of issues that get people angry or upset, but not really dealing with the whole problem. And that cycle of just dealing with these hot-button issues in a way that isn't really meant to solve any problems, that could be something to really be upset about, but also to take to prayer.
Well, a couple of points that you made earlier about this, about going back to birth control, that the reason for a man and a woman to get together is to create a baby, a child. That is not the only reason that man and woman get together.
That's correct, and the church
explicitly
states that.
And after menopause, the women can't have babies any longer. Mm-hmm. Men and women continue to have sex.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's why the church talks about a natural openness to life, regardless of whether the people involved are actually capable of it. They are naturally capable of it by virtue of being men and women. Certainly past menopause, certainly in advanced age, pregnancy is no longer a realistic thing that would happen, but the natural relationship is open to life. So that is one way the church looks at it.
Right, but the other dimension which the church states, it's not just about producing new life. It's about unity, it's about love, it's about developing relationship. Those are the two, right? Life and love. Those are the two dimensions of sexual life, sexual relations. And both of those are center stage. So a lot of times, sometimes we only focus on the reproductive aspect of it, but that's not what the church teaches. That's not the only reason. So I just want to be clear about that, because that's very important.
Yeah. The other point that I just want to, what does the church, the situation of a teenager being pregnant from rape or incest? Mm-hmm. Okay, church is saying, have the baby. Second grade commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, How that teenager may not want to have the baby because she was raped or victim of incest. What does the Catholic Church do about that? Mm-hmm. About that kid?
Yeah. The church would certainly promote greater social services for an individual who is in that situation. Certainly increasing the availability of not just adoption, but healthy, happy families who would be able to accept a child that a teenager would not be able to raise on their own. Strengthening not just the nuclear family, but extended families, such that children who might be born from tragic situations in teenage pregnancies might be able to be cared for within a family with enough love to give and enough resources to share that they'd be able to care for such a child. But also, just other social services that would promote the ability of mothers generally to care for their children, regardless of where the life may have come from, whether it was an attack on their dignity that led to that life, or whether it was, in fact, a natural pregnancy that they desire. In either case, especially though, in the case of those who are most vulnerable, those who have been most subject to abuse or attack, our society should prioritize them above all else. So if we are not doing enough to help young people in that situation, that should move our conscience to action. It should cause us to change our policy so that people in those situations are better served, so that abortion would not be perceived as a necessary evil, because the church does not believe that it is acceptable, that a direct abortion is permissible in any situation. Indirect abortions are one area of moral theology that could be discussed, as far as if there's an issue related to the need for a hysterectomy, and we could talk about that another time. But the issue involved with pregnancy here, our church advises that we have to have a concern for mothers, and our society should promote their well-being, especially because they are giving our world the most precious gift of life.
And once again, not to in any way take away from the horrible nature of that situation and the incredible challenges, but just two things to keep in mind, and that is that two wrongs don't make a right. And second, when you start seeking death as the answer to problems, that leads in very bad directions. But once again, not to take away from the horrible nature and the incredible challenge of that situation. But just a couple of philosophical things to think about in terms of two wrongs making a right, and promoting the idea of death as the answer to life's problems.
And not making the baby the victim. The baby didn't commit that crime.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much for coming today and keeping an open mind. Let's continue to pray as we prepare for voting. And it's not just this election. It's about how we live in society with each other. It's about how we get along with each other, how we seek the common good, how we try to solve issues rather than just stand for things that get people upset. Let's try to come together and seek the wisdom that comes from Christ. So go forth. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.